it is my absolute pleasure to invite Aisha Thomas to the stage. Aisha Thomas is the founder of Representation Matters, an organisation that provides workshops, talks and consultancy on diversity, equity and inclusion for schools and businesses. She was also a former assistant principal responsible for diversity, equity and inclusion. Her talk today is titled Being Black British, Living Within the Hyphen, and please join me in welcoming Aisha to the stage.
All right, I feel a little bit like Janet Jackson with this, like what's going on, what's going on? Right, let me sort myself out and get this all sorted and then we'll be all right. Doesn't like me, it doesn't want to stay as I want it to. Let's do it this way. Okay, how are you all? You all right? Good, good, good. All right, so we're going to get started. And I feel, first of all, I just want to start by saying a big, massive thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. I feel honored to be able to take up space and share my story. So I stand here today as a woman, a neurodistinct woman, a neurodistinct Black woman, a neurodistinct Black British woman, born in the 1980s, of Jamaican heritage, trying to find my way home to self. I seek connection with the diaspora whilst trying to understand what does Pan-Africanism mean to me. I'm floating somewhere between this projected racialization of blackness and this inherited nationality of Britishness. My truth is my truth. My journey is my journey. Yet I understand that two things can be right and yet be wrong for each person. I don't stand here and speak for all Black people. We all have varying degrees of experience and proximity to the conversation we're going to have today. So I want you to take care of yourself as you're navigating and questioning and challenging yourself when we're talking about race and systemic injustice, because it can evoke emotion, passion, and realizations of difference. Now, we've all had that moment, a moment when we knew we were racialized, the moment when we knew we were operating in a system that perpetuates the systemic system of racial hierarchy. You learn that this experience is also impacted by your geographical location and the context that you find yourself in. Here you are just trying to have a human experience. And yet you have to reconcile with the cards that you've been dealt. How am I going to deal with them? How am I going to make the right choices? What are the decisions that I'm going to make? You go through this process of understanding. You learn that there's a global understanding of the power of whiteness. And even if it's not consciously accepted, white supremacy weaves its way through all of our systems and every aspect of our lives. And you begin to realize how these dualities of experience permeate your life. Some will deny it, some will be indifferent to it, some will fight it, and some will be angry at it. And yet some will pretend they can't even see it, but it is there. An important part of this experience is also the time when you have these realizations, and education often plays a crucial role in this awakening. Whether this be peer-to-peer, whether it's your family home, or for the curriculum that you are taught. But the role is key and it's vital. Arguably, I'm biased. I'm an ex-assistant principal. I care about education. But many stories, including my own, started here. And if only it could have arrived at my door like an Amazon delivery. I could have chose the delivery time and date. I could have received some instructions that somehow told me how I'm supposed to wear this, how I should navigate the world. If only. So today I'm thinking about some critical thinkers, some luminaries, whether that's W.D. Du Bois, Fanon and Hooke, and many more. What will become of us in this conversation? In the experience of Black embodiment that is gendered, it's regional, it's political, it's historical. And that event of realization, It forms the concepts that are generated from each of our lived experiences. It reckons with us. And we understand that we are embodying the politics of this. We are political. Which means, therefore, I have to think about how I'm going to navigate this human experience because it's not generalized. I cannot define blackness for you. It's a lived experience. But I can attempt to understand the differences that we will experience. But I have a bit of nervousness. I feel a bit tentative about this conversation. Because when we say blackness, we say black culture, we say black experience, and we say Britishness. I know that we're not all one of the same. So understanding my experience of the world and how it affects me from the inside out and what I'm projecting, how I'm meshed into a world that doesn't want me or doesn't recognize me, has not been easy. I've been displaced. I've been cut off from my African roots. So I'm seeking connection from the diaspora. And I understand that now is the time for me to question, what does it mean? So welcome to my talk. Black and British, living within the hyphen. So after years of political debate about whether the education system in the United Kingdom is indeed racist, I am very clear there is much work to do. And whilst there is agreement that inequality in education is a factor in the trajectory of a child's educational experience and their development and their subsequent life chances, whether race is a factor is still heavily contested, as was shared in the SUA report in 2021. Now, teaching black history and focusing on anti-racism is not compulsory for all schools. Where it's taught, the government's political guidance around impartiality has left some educators feeling scared and confused. What can I say? What can't I say? Fearful that they've got to find these balanced arguments that if I say this, you might say that my actions are unlawful. However, this can undermine what we're trying to do here. Our anti-racist education efforts can sometimes end up creating further confusion and hinder the meaningful discussions that we all know we're trying to have. Now, a form of this contestation that we have to think about is how race as a key factor has been seen in the recent motivated race riots we've seen this summer. And it's been framed as it just being about immigration. Yet their focus is exclusively on black and brown immigrants. Despite the debates as to whether Britain is institutionally racist or not, the focus of these riots is a reminder of the significance of race in what constitutes British identity for many of its citizens. Now, the ongoing debate about race and immigration in the UK reveals a disturbing undercurrent of racial discrimination that often goes unnoticed by some people in the public. In my experience, from my perspective, I think the UK is still very much racist. Ibrahim X. Kahindi, in his book, How to Become Anti-Racist, he defines racism as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. This normalization of the policies led some to argue that the riots were not racist, but were about immigration. However, the riots reflect a racialized xenophobia that overlooks immigrants racialized as white. The anti-immigration and the anti-woke narratives of politicians have directly impacted this lens and fueled these ideologies. In my own life, these abstracted conversations about race, national identity, and democracy have had terrifying implications. The reality of this has become deeply disturbing. The stress of not knowing who is for me and who is against me continues a cycle of trauma. When I walk down the street now and I meet someone racialized as white who I've not met before, I'm having this moment, this second, where I'm waiting for them to smile or to hold that stern face, so that I know if I need to cross the road, turn around, and walk away. What way is that to exist in 2024 when I'm having to make safety plans about my existence? And yet I was born here. My parents were born here. And yet you tell me I'm British. but am I really? Part of the intensity of this feeling is the moment that black people make an assertion of humanity. It has its roots in what Fanon talks about when he mentions this zone of non-being. Fanon talks about this notion in his seminal works, Black Skin, White Masks. And Fanon explores the psychological effects of colonization on black people, particularly how colonialism imposed an alienated identity that leads to feelings of inferiority and non-belonging. Colonialism is a total project that was successful. It did what it was designed to do. It leaves no aspect untouched. And even as I'm talking to you now, it's present. It's in the room with us right now. It's in the aspects of everything that we do. So when I think about my grandparents, my ancestors, the elimination of all connections to me and Africa over centuries and generations, I can't but help think I'm missing out. So the movement of moving out, trying to take place, resisting, can be problematic and blocked with the ultimate violence and death and destruction. How dare I think I have value in what they call Britishness? So how does one imagine moving out of this space? Fanon talks about how language can be one of the strategies, but it's not a tool. But it's a way we can create connection and understanding and meaning. He says, to speak a language is to enter a world. To speak a language is to adopt a culture and a civilization. He's making an observation about the function of language and how it speaks to and from our existence. This idea of being proper, learning to speak standard English, a competency that I've heard argued time and time in schools. If we don't teach them to talk properly, they won't be successful. Who talks properly? Whose language? Whose slang? Whose dialect? Does my patois make you feel uncomfortable? When I come into a room and I say to a student, well, go on, why does that make you feel some type of way? I want us to think about how we value language. And I want us to think about this notion of competency and what we think competency should be. Learn standard English. You'll need this to be successful. But what does this mean to me living in an anti-black world, learning the language of English? As the reality is, no matter how I speak, it is still being connected to a world and a civilization. It's an English language that I am speaking. But even when I'm speaking English, I have the nationality of British. There's still a limit that's been set. I'm still a black woman speaking English. Then enters the criticism of my diction, my phrasing, my use of the language. So it doesn't matter how well I master the language, I still speak it from a black body. Now, a key component of understanding the trauma I'm experiencing is understanding the connection in which I was educated, the context in which I understood myself. Du Bois, in his book, The Souls of Black Folks, talks about what it means to be black in an interracial society, and he refers to this notion of double consciousness, the idea of experiencing yourself through the lens of the society that's discriminating against you. And he says these words: it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in an amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two worrying ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Powerful sentiments. The experience of my grandparents, who were part of the Windrush generation, to name them by a ship, and of my parents who were educated at the end of a categorization of black children as educationally subnormal, inform my understanding of this double consciousness. I, though, have been educated and gone on to teach in a different, arguably more progressive time. Less divisive time? Yet the continuous thread that exists, irrespective of the lens of time, is that racial inequality continues to pervade the education system in the UK. The sensation of this double consciousness remains powerful and real. My double consciousness, that duality of perception, are everyday markers of experience that are wrapped in this historical and political and social context. Yet there's this additional layer of personal experience that exists. So when did I know I was black? Well, I can recall the exact moment. I was 11 years of age, and I was at school, and a friend was throwing a party. Everyone in the class was invited, but me. I asked about my invitation, and she explained that I could not go to her house because I was black. Now, the context of this was I attended a school which was predominantly white middle class in Kingswood in South Gloucestershire. But nothing could have prepared me for that moment of knowing my skin carried weight, and that weight meant exclusion. Now, my education introduced me to blackness, also through my history lessons. Being told that I am of African descent, so then began this wonderful connection and understanding with what it means to be black. But then I'm quickly told, but you were enslaved. Pictures of naked or half-naked people being marched onto boats. That's your people. That's where you come from. That's your beginning. All of a sudden, that brief second of feeling connection was snatched back because now it's being replaced with trauma. You're now black because you're dehumanized and we stripped you of your humanity. And there is a unique point that I just want us to note about the British context, because here I'm black and I'm British. I'm reduced to a color. But at least if I'm American, I get to be African American. But here, that nationality, that connection to self is gone. You're just black. There was a shift in my understanding of blackness, and for the first time I understood I wasn't just a child, I was a black child. And like the Bois, I made a commitment to be better than my white counterparts, so that they could value me as a black person. I'll show you, I'm going to go to that party. This began the chapter of me. A key lens in these experiences is the interpersonal experience with those who are racialized as white. Well-meaning white folk who stand in solidarity mention their donations to me about what they give to Africa. They tell me about their black squares that they post on social media, and they tell me about the marches that they go to. And these are attempts to connect to the sense of outrage of those who are black. Yet I know the experiences of trauma that I feel in those moments when stood by side at a counter-protest will never be the same. The need of those racialized as white to stand and support in the context of these riots also underlines the common understanding, though, that black people are perceived to be the problem. After all, the outcry when a black person commits any act is not deemed to just be. It's deemed against the standard of whiteness. It's very different. Would the riots have still happened if the murder had been of 3 black British girls? I doubt not. In all of this, I understand that I'm perceived as the problem, but the question I have for myself is, what does it mean to be the problem? The journey that I'm exploring is the distance between myself, who knows me, and the world that I try and see myself within. There is complexity to the white gaze that perceives me as a problem. It's not just tied to the individual, it's embedded in the systems, and the systems form the social and political and cultural processes with which anti-blackness is woven. There is a need for me to understand the fusion of black and Britishness and the anti-blackness and expressions of the double consciousness. It's important to acknowledge the hyphen between black and British, because the Britishness has an undertone of anti-blackness, and yet the black element is marked as inferior to the Britishness, One cannot exist without the other, yet together they cause trauma and pain. These systems are difficult to navigate. Now, I've operated in spaces and places where I felt that making the right choices that would challenge the system and the status quo, positioned as a black assistant principal, being the only black female in my school at one point in a majority black population school, headed up equalities groups and championed anti-racism, and yet I was still steeped in overwhelming judgment for my choices and accolades. I've been called a coconut. I've been told that I need to enjoy my time on the plantation and say hello to massa. My proximity and choice is seen as an endorsement of the very systems of oppression. I argued that I was trying to fight against the system, but the weight of the educational profile as a black educator was traumatizing. Feeling that I was not good enough for black folk, and yet I was not good enough for white folk. What was I missing and what couldn't I see? How much was my work in white spaces affecting my assimilation and tone policing and code switching? How much is my lack of education and understanding of self meant that I didn't understand what it meant to truly be black? I now have a deep sense of responsibility because books normalized not me knowing, society normalized that I didn't know, and I was reduced to the sum of racial construct and not understanding the trauma I was carrying. Was I just simply a black woman trying to survive? And a good friend of mine said to visit Ghana, so I did. Challenge accepted. What else could I learn that I didn't know? After all, I'm writing a doctoral thesis on race, education, and trauma. I have black skin and I'm living in it. But he warned me. He said, Aisha, you are going to cry. I said, no, I won't. I'll be fine. I can intellectualize the experience. And after 3 hours from Accra to the coast, I stood on the bridge and my ancestors greeted me. I was flooded in the experience. I was sweating profusely, tears pouring down my face. I was inconsolable. I entered the room and I touched the stones that my ancestors touched, and I looked at the room that said, no return. And I turned to the wall and I touched it and I whispered and I said, I've returned. The reality of what the British did hit me, yet here I am claiming I'm black and I'm British. I recount the UK education system, the tsunami of experience, the impact of the education system, and little did I know I was drinking the Kool-Aid and I was part of the problem. Hook says, knowing how to be solitary is essential to the art of loving. When we can be alone, we can be with others without using them as a means of escape. But the question is still ringing deeply. Something's laying dormant in me, and it was activated. And so for a long time, I felt I lost something that my grandparents, my parents hadn't taught me, the education system hadn't taught me, that connection to self. And I began to notice a pattern. It was access. Those who understood had supplementary education. They went to supplementary school. They had the origins and the narratives, and they knew. They played the game, but they knew. And then Hook says, I'm struck by how deeply our identities are shaped by the forces of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. These forces want to determine our destiny to keep us from being self-determined. So as I come to a close, I just want us to think about these things. I now need to be intentional about loving me. I needed to be honest about the fact that I'm shaving my hair in 2015 and getting my kinky coily hair and reconnecting to myself, even though I knew that when I had my afro out, the black in the black British was bigger. A physical connection created that root. An action was small, but it was significant. I no longer sit in the guilt of not knowing. I no longer judge people for how they experience their blackness, but I challenge you to lean into the hyphen. What is leaving and what is there within you? The gaze works in many ways. The gaze is racialized, it's become internalized by those racialized as black and those racialized as white and all of us in between. But where can we draw resistance? What does resistance now look like? Because if I'm born in a world where I inherit the label of blackness, who has the responsibility to do the work? Is it that I should go to supplementary school, or should the education system be doing this for all? Should we all be gifted the knowledge of truth? However uncomfortable this may be, are we brave enough? Do we have the courage? Is not a small step, is not a small ask. So as we go on to think about the world of colonization that we're navigating, the possibility is still here. We are redefining what it means to be black and British. We are defining what it needs to be British. So even though the system says no, and I was taught to forget, I was taught to believe I was inferior, and I believed I had lost, I stepped onto that bridge, and my body whispered, I still remember. Thanks for listening.
Hello, perfect, it's working. Thank you, Aisha Thomas, for that conversation on living within the hyphen. I think for diaspora, you kind of feel as if, what is your identity when you're kind of between two? How do you connect to both, but not feel like you're letting go of another? I feel like it's very fascinating, the point you mentioned about how it's personal. You can't look for a textbook to tell you who you are, your identity. You can't look for a universal definition. That deconstructing comes from realizing it's personal and that you need to work on that and find that for yourself. So with all the lovely words you shared, I want to open it up to the audience now. We've got a little bit of time for a Q&A, so any questions in the audience? We can take a few, about 3, 4. Yes, gentleman here on this middle table. Oh, middle table.
Do I stay sitting or stand up?
It's up to you.
I'll stand up. I listened to what you had to say, and I commend you. You shared your experience. I also share, and I'm sure most black people share similar experiences, and you articulated it because you're well educated. I don't have the advantage. My biggest concern is that you shared an experience. I'm a bit tense and anxious, you know. I'm not a public speaker. And my concern is, it's about how do we change this? It's about change. And I would like to hear solutions as to break down this oppressive system that exists globally. We experience it from a personal perspective, but it's something that's widespread, occupying every space, every human space that exists in the world. And there are people here who are aware of it, because that's why they're here, to make a difference. Now, there's something happening in the world, and there's a conflict taking place, the changing order of things as they are. And it's a challenge to white supremacy. And it's not going down peacefully. And it may end up in a state where basically we're all shafted, because it means so much to the white supremacists in America and Europe, and the alliances they've created and formed around the world. Now, this is a wonderful opportunity for people to basically take sides on this and do something about it. And at the moment, there are many, many people, particularly in social media, that are voicing very, very strong opinions about it. And they may come from different political perspectives, whether you call it socialism or whatever and so on. But not disregarding racism is racism, whether it's colorism. And this construct creates this horrible problem where, like it or not, Europeans have conquered the world and basically helping themselves to the resources of the people, and they have the audacity to say that you're backwards, you know, and they give you loans as the IMF and the World Bank. I'm going on a bit, and I'll stop shortly. But these things, it boils my skin. All this literature I'm very aware of, I've read, and there are other people who do the same thing. And we're just looking for a way out of this terrible oppression. I'm 72 years old, coming up soon, you know, and I've lived through this. I'm thinking, gosh, I'm going to go into my grave, and this thing is going to persist, you know. Where's the light at the end of the tunnel? To think there are places in Africa, South Africa, for example, where you have a minority of Europeans controlling and the resources of the majority. And, you know, it's the world goes on, and, you know, no one says anything, no one does anything, and the political leaders in Africa and throughout the world, they're just puppets of this existing, oppressive regime, you know. And basically, I'd love to hear people come up with solutions. You know, it's nice sharing. Come up with solutions and say, how can we stop this? And that goes for white, black people, everybody. How can we stop this? Because it's going to lead to our own destruction. And this is something that, you know, it's round the corner. It's round the corner. So anyway, that's what I've got to say.
Thank you for that question. I think we'll just stick to this one for time purposes.
Right.
But there's plenty more time, won't there, be, to ask questions. If you've got anything at the end, we've got loads of breaks and breakout spaces. If you want to get into a deeper conversation and ask those questions, we'll have that time for that. Thank you.
Awesome. Do you want me to respond on this? Okay. All right. I don't disagree. I absolutely agree with you. And I think that it's twofold. I think the first thing is we keep trying to dismantle a system that is so entrenched in the way in which you described. We will not be able to just dismantle it that simply. It's not going to work. It's been doing what it's been doing for hundreds of years for a purpose. We need to do something very, very radical in order to do so. But I guess my suggestion, and is the area that I lean into, is the education of the next generation. Now, I can speak as a mother of a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old who are navigating this conversation, and I will say this next generation coming through are being so unapologetic about their position in society today, and they're not accepting it. It is changing. It does feel different. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but I think there's something about how education can be used radically to speak truth to power, to dismantle systems in a different way. But it does require a collective commitment to see that change come through, and for us to use our young people, and I don't mean exploit them, but use their energy and their commitment to seeing Britishness, to seeing the global perspective in a very different way, and saying, no, we're not having this for our future. This is now what our future is going to be. So for me, I think education is a massive part of the solution, and that's where I start my journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for Aisha?